My ex-mother-in-law looked me straight in the eyes and said something so cruel that the entire room went silent. She thought she had won. She thought I had lost everything. But 4 minutes later, one unexpected phone call exposed a secret she never saw coming, and the smile vanished from her face. The day my ex-husband signed the divorce papers, his mother celebrated like she just won the lottery. I wish I were exaggerating. Most people expect sadness at the end of a marriage. Maybe disappointment, maybe regret, but not Margaret. No. Margaret treated my divorce like a national holiday. Even during the marriage, she never tried to hide how much she disliked me. The strange thing was, I never gave her a reason. I wasn't rude. I wasn't irresponsible. I loved her son for 10 years. I attended every family gathering, remembered every birthday, bought thoughtful gifts, helped during emergencies, and smiled through countless insults. Nothing was ever enough. If I cooked dinner, it wasn't the right recipe. If I dressed nicely, I was showing off. If I stayed quiet, I was arrogant. If I spoke up, I was disrespectful. Everything I did somehow became evidence that I wasn't good enough for her precious son, Daniel. The sad part, Daniel rarely defended me. At first, I thought he was trying to keep the peace. Then I thought he was afraid of confrontation. Eventually, I realized something much worse. He agreed with her. Not openly, not directly, but in 1,000 small ways. The silence, the excuses, the shrugging, the way he always expected me to be the one who apologized. Even when I wasn't wrong. Our marriage didn't collapse overnight. It died slowly, like a house rotting from the inside while everyone pretends the walls are still strong. Years passed, arguments became routine, conversations became negotiations. Love became obligation. Then one day, I discovered something that finally shattered whatever remained. Daniel wasn't working late. Daniel wasn't attending extra meetings. Daniel wasn't helping clients. Daniel was having an affair. I still remember the exact moment I learned the truth. The restaurant, the corner booth, the way he laughed at something another woman said, the way he touched her hand, the way he looked at her, a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I stood outside the restaurant window for nearly 5 minutes. Frozen. Unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to understand how someone who once promised forever could become a complete stranger. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. That hurt almost more than the betrayal itself. No excuses. No panic. No guilt, just exhaustion. Like he'd been waiting for me to find out. 3 months later, our marriage was over. At least legally. Emotionally, it had ended long before. I moved into a small apartment across town, started rebuilding my life, focused on work, focused on healing, focused on surviving. Then came the final property meeting. The one meeting I desperately wanted to avoid. Our attorneys had arranged a formal discussion to finalize several remaining financial matters. It should have been simple. Professional. Quick. Instead, it became one of the strangest days of my life because Margaret showed up uninvited. The moment I walked into the conference room, I saw her sitting beside Daniel. Her expression immediately told me everything. She hadn't come to help, she'd come to watch. To witness what she believed was my defeat. The lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody wanted drama, but Margaret practically radiated it. I took my seat, opened my folder, ignored her. For nearly 20 minutes, things remained professional. Numbers. Documents. Signatures. Property discussions. Then the meeting ended. Everyone stood. The attorneys began gathering papers, and that's when Margaret made her move. She stepped directly in front of me. Crossed her arms. Smiled. And said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." The room froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Daniel looked uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to stop her. Of course not, Margaret continued. "I told him years ago that he'd regret marrying you." She laughed softly. "I guess he finally listened." The humiliation hit like a slap, not because her opinion mattered, not anymore, but because of where she chose to say it, because of the audience, because she wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone in that room to see her victory. For a moment, I considered responding. I imagined all the things I could say. About Daniel's affair, about her interference, about the years she spent poisoning our marriage. Instead, I stayed silent. Sometimes silence speaks louder. Margaret interpreted that silence as weakness. Her smile widened. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing to say." Then she leaned closer, close enough for only me to hear. "You should be grateful he stayed as long as he did." The cruelty of that sentence shocked even me. I stared at her. And suddenly realized something. Happy people don't act like this. People who truly win don't need to announce it. People at peace don't spend years trying to destroy someone else. Margaret wasn't celebrating. She was obsessed. Obsessed with proving she was right. Obsessed with controlling the narrative. Obsessed with making sure everyone believed I was the villain. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then my phone vibrated. One message, unknown number. I glanced down and immediately frowned. The message contained only 6 words. That was it. No name. No explanation. No context. Just those words. I looked around. Confused. Margaret was still talking. Still lecturing. Still enjoying herself. I ignored the message and placed my phone back into my purse. But something felt strange. Very strange, because moments later another message arrived. This one from the same number. A chill ran down my spine. I had no idea who was sending these messages, yet somehow they seemed certain about where I was. Certain about what was happening. Certain that something important was about to occur. Meanwhile, Daniel was preparing to leave. His attorney shook hands with mine. People started exiting. The meeting was effectively over. Then Margaret delivered one final insult. She looked around the room and proudly declared, "Now my son can finally build the life he deserves." The statement echoed through the conference room. And just as she finished speaking, my phone rang. The same unknown number. Every instinct told me to answer. So I did. I pressed the button. Raised the phone to my ear. And heard a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 15 years, a voice that instantly made my heart stop. The caller said only one sentence that changed everything. One sentence that made my knees weak. One sentence that explained why someone had told me to stay exactly where I was. The voice said, "Don't leave that building. They're about to learn who really owns half of Daniel's company." My entire body went cold. Because the person speaking was someone who was supposed to be completely out of our lives. Someone Daniel prayed would never return. Someone Margaret believed she'd gotten rid of forever, and suddenly I realized the divorce wasn't actually over. Not even close. The voice on the phone belonged to a man I hadn't spoken to in almost 15 years. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was imagining things. My grip tightened around the phone. The conference room suddenly felt smaller. The sounds around me faded into the background. I could barely hear my own breathing. "Hello," I whispered. The caller sighed. "Claire, it's me." I closed my eyes. There was no mistaking that voice. Richard Mercer, Daniel's father. The man who had disappeared from the family years ago. The man Margaret treated as if he never existed. The man Daniel refused to discuss. The man who supposedly abandoned his wife and son without explanation. At least, that's the story I'd always been told. The story Margaret repeated at every opportunity. The story Daniel believed. The story everyone accepted. Until now, Richard, I asked. Across the room, Margaret was still talking to one of the attorneys. Daniel was gathering paperwork. Neither had noticed my expression. "Listen carefully," Richard said. "You have about 3 minutes before they find out I'm back." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What are you talking about? I'll explain everything." His voice sounded older, tired, but determined. "First, tell me one thing. What? Did Daniel force the company settlement through before finalizing the divorce?" My heart skipped. "How do you know about that?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Because that's exactly what Margaret would tell him to do." I stared at the floor. The company. Of course. Everything suddenly pointed back to the company. Daniel owned a rapidly growing logistics business. Or at least that's what everyone believed during the divorce proceedings. His attorneys had worked aggressively to keep me away from anything connected to it. I hadn't fought much. I was exhausted. Emotionally drained. The last thing I wanted was years of legal warfare. I just wanted freedom. Peace. A fresh start. But now Richard's words were making me question everything. "What aren't they telling me?" I asked. There was a pause. Then Richard spoke carefully. "Daniel doesn't own that company." My stomach dropped. "What? He owns part of it." I looked toward my ex-husband. He was standing near the exit, completely unaware. "Then who owns the rest?" Another pause. Then, "You do." I nearly dropped the phone. The room spun. For a second I thought I had misheard him. I had never invested in Daniel's company. You never purchased shares. I shook my head. Ownership agreements. Impossible. It isn't. Never attended executive meetings. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a shareholder. I wasn't anything. At least, that's what I believed. Richard lowered his voice. "Margaret never wanted you to know." A chill ran through me. "What are you talking about?" 15 years ago, before Daniel launched the company, I created a trust. The words came slowly. Deliberately. As though he'd rehearsed them. "I knew Margaret." His voice hardened. "I knew exactly how controlling she could become." I glanced toward her. She was laughing, completely unaware. "For years she manipulated everyone around her." Richard continued. "So I protected my son's future." I swallowed. "Protected it how?" "The trust funded the company." I felt my pulse accelerating. The startup capital came from me. My mouth went dry. "The company only exists because of that trust." I struggled to process what he was saying. Then he delivered another shock. "The trust had one condition." "What condition?" "If Daniel ever married, ownership protections would automatically activate." I stared into space. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Richard continued. The spouse would become a protected beneficiary. I froze. The words hit me like lightning. Protected beneficiary. Not Daniel. Me. The spouse. Me. My legs felt weak. Why? Richard sighed. Because I knew Margaret. Double quotes again. Those same words. I knew she'd eventually try to control everything. His voice grew softer. I wanted to make sure no woman married into that family and ended up trapped. The room blurred. For 10 years I had believed I was powerless. For 10 years I believed Margaret held all the cards. For 10 years I believed Daniel controlled everything. And now this man was telling me an entirely different story. But why didn't anyone tell me? Richard laughed. There was no humor in it. Because Margaret found out. A knot formed in my stomach. She fought me for years. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Eventually she convinced Daniel I was trying to manipulate him. The pieces started falling into place, painful pieces. Ugly pieces, pieces hidden for years. Richard continued. After enough arguments, I left. My heart sank. All those years, all those stories, all those accusations, had Margaret lied? Not just to me. To everyone. What happens now? I asked. Richard took a deep breath. I filed documents yesterday. The room suddenly felt ice cold. What documents? The trust has been reactivated. My eyes widened. What does that mean? It means a complete ownership review begins immediately. I looked toward Daniel again, still smiling, still relaxed, still convinced the divorce was finished, still convinced he'd won. Richard's next words changed everything. It also means Daniel's attorneys just made a catastrophic mistake. A rush of adrenaline hit me. What mistake? They finalized negotiations without disclosing protected trust assets. I wasn't a lawyer, but even I understood enough to realize that sounded serious, very serious. How serious? Richard answered instantly. Potentially devastating. My pulse raced. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. A man entered carrying a thick legal folder. The moment Margaret saw him, her smile disappeared. Completely. Instantly. The transformation was shocking. It was like watching someone see a ghost. The man walked directly toward us. Daniel turned. Confused. Then concerned, then alarmed because he recognized him too. The newcomer stopped in front of the table, opened the folder, and said for simple words, "We need to talk." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The tension became unbearable. The attorney looked directly at Daniel. Then Margaret. Then me. Finally, he placed several documents on the table. These were filed this morning. Margaret's face had gone pale. "What is this?" she demanded. The attorney ignored her. Instead, he turned toward me. Double quotes Mrs. Bennett. I blinked. Technically, I was still Mrs. Bennett until the paperwork completed. Yes, the attorney offered a small smile. You're going to want to read these. I looked down. The top page contained one phrase. A phrase that instantly made Margaret gasp. The room exploded. "What?" Daniel shouted. Margaret lunged forward. "No." The word came out almost like a scream. "No, no, no." For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret looked terrified. Not angry, not arrogant, terrified. And that's when I realized something important she already knew. She knew exactly what those documents meant, which meant Richard had been telling the truth. All of it. Every word. Daniel looked between us. What is happening? Nobody answered. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Then calmly delivered another bombshell. Pending review. All major company asset transfers are temporarily frozen. Silence. Absolute silence. Daniel looked stunned. Margaret looked sick, and I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, hope. But the biggest revelation was still coming. Because as the attorney opened the next file, his expression changed. He looked directly at me, then at Daniel. Then back at me. And said, "There is another issue." The room became still. "What issue?" Daniel asked. The attorney inhaled slowly. As part of the review, investigators uncovered several transactions. Margaret's hands started shaking. The attorney continued, "Large transactions." Daniel frowned. "What kind of transactions?" The attorney opened another page, and when he spoke again, Margaret nearly collapsed into a chair. Because the money wasn't missing. It wasn't stolen by strangers. It wasn't lost. The transactions all led to one person. One person who had secretly been taking money for years. One person nobody suspected. One person whose name appeared over and over again. And that name was Margaret Bennett. The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that lasts a few seconds, the kind that feels heavy. The kind that changes everything. I stared at the document. Then at Margaret. Then back at the document. My eyes kept returning to the same line. Again. And again. And again. The attorney slowly turned another page, then another. Then another. Every page contained the same name. Margaret. 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 For years. Thousands of dollars. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. The total made my stomach drop. Daniel looked physically ill. No, his voice cracked. No, that's impossible. Margaret immediately stood. This is ridiculous. The attorney didn't react. She pointed at the documents. Those are reimbursements. Nobody responded. Those were gifts. Still nothing. Those were family distributions. The attorney calmly folded his hands. Mrs. Bennett, would you like me to continue reading the report for the first time in my life? Margaret looked afraid, not annoyed, not defensive. Afraid. The attorney continued anyway. The review indicates that company funds were transferred through multiple accounts connected to Mrs. Bennett. Over a period of 11 years, Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. His face was pale. What is he talking about? Margaret immediately grabbed his arm. Daniel, don't listen to this, the attorney interrupted. The records are verified. Daniel looked at her. Then the papers, then her again. His entire world was beginning to crack. Because until that moment, Margaret had always been the person with answers. The person who knew everything, the person who controlled everything. Now she couldn't even look her son in the eye. I watched her carefully. And suddenly I remembered dozens of strange moments over the years. The luxury vacations she couldn't afford. The expensive jewelry. The new vehicles. The renovations. The mysterious purchases. Every time someone asked how she paid for them, she always gave the same answer: investments. Apparently, that answer wasn't entirely true. The attorney opened another file. I'm also required to disclose additional findings. Margaret's face somehow became even whiter. My heart pounded. Additional findings. There was more. The attorney nodded toward Daniel. The review uncovered evidence that company financial reports were intentionally altered. Daniel froze. What? Certain transfers were concealed. The room spun. I looked toward Margaret. She knew, she absolutely knew. The attorney continued. The alterations allowed funds to leave the company without triggering standard review procedures. Daniel took a step backward. He looked like a man discovering his entire childhood had been a lie. Because maybe it had. Who authorized that? He asked. The attorney looked directly at Margaret. Nobody needed further explanation. The answer was obvious. For years, Margaret had quietly positioned herself as an advisor, a consultant, a trusted voice, a protector. Now it appeared she had been something else entirely: a manipulator, a thief, a woman who believed the rules didn't apply to her. Then something happened that shocked everyone. Daniel started laughing, not happy laughter, not relieved laughter. The laughter of someone whose reality has shattered, a broken sound, almost painful to hear. Margaret reached toward him. Honey, he pulled away. The look on his face made her freeze. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't seeing his mother, he was seeing the truth. And he didn't like what he saw. You told me she ruined everything. His voice trembled. Margaret blinked. What? He pointed at me. You spent years telling me she was the problem. I stood motionless. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. You told me Dad abandoned us. Margaret's breathing became uneven. You told me he never cared. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everybody knew this wasn't about money anymore. This was about 20 years of lies. Daniel looked shattered. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Did he leave because of you? Margaret said nothing, and that silence was answer enough. The room became painfully quiet. The attorney quietly stepped back. Even the lawyers seemed unwilling to interrupt. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. It was a family collapse. Daniel's voice broke. Tell me the truth. Margaret stared at the floor. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she whispered, I did what I had to do. Daniel closed his eyes. The disappointment on his face was devastating because children can survive many things. But discovering your hero isn't who you thought they were. That leaves scars. Deep ones. Margaret suddenly looked older, much older. Like the weight of years had finally landed on her shoulders. Then she did something nobody expected. She sat down. And started crying. Real tears. Not dramatic tears, not manipulative tears, the kind that come when a person realizes the game is over. For decades she had controlled the narrative. Now the truth was standing in the middle of the room. And nobody could hide from it anymore. The attorney eventually cleared his throat. There is one final matter. Everyone looked toward him. He opened the last folder. Then turned to me. Double quotes Mrs. Bennett. I swallowed. Yes, he smiled gently. The ownership review is complete. My pulse skyrocketed. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Not anymore. Not after everything else. The attorney continued. Under the trust agreement established by Richard Mercer. He paused. Double quotes. You retain significant beneficiary rights. The room became still. Daniel looked stunned. Margaret looked defeated. I barely breathed. The attorney handed me the documents. Then spoke the words that changed my future forever. Congratulations. I blinked. What? He smiled. You are now entitled to a substantial ownership settlement. My mind went blank. The amount written on the page was larger than anything I'd ever imagined. Larger than my apartment. Larger than my savings. Larger than every financial fear I'd carried since the divorce began. For years I believed I was walking away with almost nothing. Instead, I had unknowingly been protected all along, protected by a man everyone told me was a villain. Richard, the father Margaret spent years destroying. I suddenly understood why he called. Why he returned. Why he fought. Not for revenge, for justice. A few days later, I met him in person. The meeting felt surreal. 15 years of stories had painted him as a monster. Instead, I found a tired man carrying enormous regret. We sat together for hours, talking. Laughing. Sometimes crying. He showed me documents. Letters. Records. Evidence. The truth. And with every page, the lies became clearer. Richard hadn't abandoned his family. He'd been pushed out, manipulated. Isolated. Destroyed. Yet somehow he still cared enough to protect people who never thanked him, including me, especially me. Months passed. Investigations continued. Court proceedings followed. Margaret eventually accepted a settlement agreement and avoided a lengthy public trial. The company survived. Barely. Daniel stepped away from leadership for a while. He needed time. Time to heal. Time to process. Time to understand who he was without his mother's influence. As for us, there was no romantic reunion. Too much had happened. Too much damage existed. Some bridges cannot be rebuilt. And that's okay. Not every ending needs to become a beginning. Sometimes closure is enough. One afternoon, nearly a year later, Daniel called. We met at a quiet coffee shop. He looked different. Calmer. Healthier. Older somehow. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I'm sorry. 3 simple words. Words I once dreamed of hearing. Words I thought would fix everything, but strangely, they didn't, because healing had already happened. Without them, still, I appreciated hearing them. He apologized for the affair, for the lies, for the silence, for failing to stand beside me, for choosing comfort over courage. When he finished, I smiled, not because the pain disappeared, but because I no longer carried it. I forgave him, not for his sake, for mine. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It frees you from carrying it. When we said goodbye, neither of us cried. Neither of us looked back. We simply walked in different directions. And for the first time in years, it felt right. A few months later, I bought a beautiful home overlooking a lake. Nothing extravagant, just peaceful. Quiet. Mine. One evening, while watching the sunset from the porch, my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Only 3 words. I smiled because he was wrong. I hadn't earned it. I'd survived it, and sometimes survival is enough. Sometimes the people who try hardest to break you accidentally build your strength. Sometimes betrayal reveals hidden truths. Sometimes losing what you thought you needed creates room for what you actually deserve. And sometimes the people celebrating your downfall have no idea that their own secrets are about to destroy them. Never measure your worth through the opinions of people determined to misunderstand you. The truth has a strange way of surfacing even after years of lies. Stay patient, stay honest, and keep moving forward. The people who underestimate you today may one day become witnesses to your greatest victory.